Hello, students. This will be my last installment of commentary on Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'm going to point out a few things about chapters 18 through 20. And I'll just mention, like all of you, I'm having to find places in my house to do this sort of online stuff. So today you get to see my basement because my son is doing online karate class upstairs and my husband's doing something for his students in another room. So here we are in my basement, and I'll tell you a bit about these last few chapters. I hope that you've read them already before you watch this video. Although if you're one of the folks who's struggling a bit with the odd language, certainly it could work to watch this video first and then read them. So this is chapters 18 through 20, and as you can see, a lot happens in these few chapters. We see this final big sort of exploration of Janie and Tea Cake's relationship. And I want to point out a few sort of sets of things about these chapters. One, it's sort of a minor note, but in these chapters, we see again Zora Neale Hurston's interest in ethnography and folklore studies in a couple of ways. One is that there's some talk about how Janie and Tea Cake have become friends with the Bahamans, the people who have come from the Bahamas up to Florida to work. And that was one of the groups of people that Hurston had done some folklore studies with. During one of the times where they're hanging around in Janie and Tea Cake's house, gambling and telling stories, there's a reference to them telling stories about Big John the Conqueror. That was referenced once earlier in the book, and that's a whole set of folk tales and mythology that was prominent among Caribbean Africans and African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. And one last thing is, during one of the points when the hurricane is getting really deadly, there's a reference to him with square toes, and that's a reference from folklore terms to just death itself. So we see her interest in folklore and ethnography come in. And another thing I wanted to point out about these chapters is, like I said, we see this exploration of Janie and Tea Cake's relationship. And one of the things that I've mentioned was a little controversial about this book was the extent to which Hurston did or did not make her writing about the political issues facing black people or oppression of black people. And in these chapters, we do see some of the ways that race really affects their lives, but we also see these ways that this novel is in some ways almost a universal story about the challenges of love and relationships. You might notice as you read these back and forth, even after Janie and Tea Cake have been together for 2 years, and Janie is a middle-aged woman and she's been through 2 marriages, but she still is insecure about Tea Cake. She had that episode already of being jealous of Nunki, and they have a couple of these little interchanges that show that both of them are still needing that constant reassurance. So, for example, after they realize the hurricane is coming and they're in danger, this is on the bottom of page 159 in my book, they're talking about what happens if you die down here. And Tea Cake says, supposing you was to die now, you wouldn't get mad at me for dragging you here? And she says, no, we've been together. If you can see the light at daybreak, you don't care if you see the dusk. She gets very philosophical about death. It's so many people never see the light at all. I was fumbling around and God opened the door, she says in reference to being with Tea Cake. And he says, well then, Janie, you meant what you didn't say, because I never knowed you were so satisfied with me like that. Like, even after 2 years, he was still insecure whether she really, really loved him. And much later in the chapter, on about page 168, or it's actually at the beginning of chapter 19, when they're talking about what to do after the hurricane and should they go back up to Eatonville or not. And they sort of have this little almost argument where they go back and forth about whether they should go back. Neither of them really wants to go. And she says, I was trying not to keep you out of your comfortable, or Tea Cake says, I don't want to keep you out of your comfortable longer than you wanted to stay. Because he maybe feels a little insecure or guilty for bringing her down where she had to work in the Everglades. And she says, if I'm in your way, like, well, if you don't want me here. And he says, well, you listen to this woman, me about to bust my britches trying to stay with her, and she she's here. He's sort of starting to say, you still don't trust me. You still don't think I really love you. And she says, all right, then you name something and we'll do it. But they have this brief little argument where, again, they still have to affirm to each other that they care. And that's one of the pieces of the novel that is recognizable and nearly universal, that pain and uncertainty of knowing for sure and trusting that someone really loves you. So having said that, and I do think that's an interesting aspect to this novel all the way through, and really comes out in this complex way in these last chapters, these are also some of the chapters where we do most strongly see the impact of racism on Janie and Tea Cake's life. So, of course, first of all, after the hurricane, we see that Tea Cake and the other black men are forced at gunpoint to go out. They're essentially kidnapped and told they have to go help bury the dead. And not only that, they're threatened with being shot if they accidentally throw a white person into one of the mass graves they're creating or waste a coffin on one of the black people. They're told they have to try and identify the bodies they're finding, whether they're white or black, and sort them. And all of the people doing this work say these bodies that have died in a flood are not always identifiable. And then we also see, in terms of how racism comes in and just the fact that they do live, although they'd been in these all-black communities, first in Eatonville and then on the muck down there in the Everglades, they've been working for white people on the Everglades. And after the tragic, violent death of Tea Cake, they put her on trial, and it's 12 white men that are the jury. And she does see these other white women there, and Janie is thinking, I wish I could tell my story to them and not these white men. We also see that all of the black people that had been their friends and living down there and working with them, had been good friends with Tea Cake for quite a lot longer than they had known Janie, initially they wanted to speak against Janie. They want Janie to be convicted of murder for shooting Tea Cake in self-defense. So we see that Hurston portrays there's not some beautiful magical unity. We saw that earlier with the references to Mrs. Turner. We saw it with the references where that leads Tea Cake to even hit Janie. So she doesn't idealize her black community, but she does show the impact of the unjust actions of the white community. So that was one of the things I wanted you to notice about these chapters. And one other thing I just want to point out in terms of sort of looking at the scope of the story and the literature is when we think about the sequence of events. This book, for some readers, is just so heartbreaking because here Tea Cake does seem to really love her and they lose each other. Janie loses Tea Cake just because of this freak accident of being there for the hurricane and then getting bit by the dog and then, of course, not having access to medicine, partly because of being poor and black. But I would point out in terms of there's a sort of a Greek classical tragic structure to this. Some of you might have studied this at some point in the past, where in Greek tragedies, often the terrible things that happens to a character is brought about by the character, some sort of tragic flaw, some fatal flaw in the character. And sometimes it's even brought about by the character trying to avoid their fate, like in the story of Oedipus. So some of you might be familiar with that. If you're not, it's okay. But I do want to point out that Tea Cake getting bit by the rabid dog happens as a result of Janie trying to help Tea Cake. Tea Cake has saved her in the water when she couldn't swim. He held her up and swam with her for a while, so he's even more exhausted than she is. And so he's just trying to rest in the middle while the hurricane is still raging. He's trying to rest in the middle of the wind and the rain. And Janie sees this sheet of tar paper that's blown off her roof and thinks, if she could just hold that over him, it would help him rest more. So Tea Cake rescues Janie. Janie, in her desire to help and comfort Tea Cake, goes to get that piece of tar paper from the roof, and that's when she gets swept into the water. Tea Cake has to rescue her again, and that's when he gets bit by the dog, who gives him rabies, and which eventually leads to his death. So, and again, here's Tea Cake having this gun, threatening to and actually trying to shoot Janie near the end, but we know at that point it's the rabies, it's the disease, it's this monster, and Janie knows that too. So it's this incredibly tragic ending that doesn't come about because of anything negative anybody has done. It comes about because of the ways Janie and Tea Cake have been trying to rescue each other. And so that's another complex aspect to the storytelling. I'll just point out again real quickly a couple of things near the end. After the trial, since Janie stays there and works for a few weeks down in the Everglades, and then she decides she may as well go back home to Eatonville, where people know her, where she still has her house and all her money in the bank. And she notices these seeds that Tea Cake had bought because he was always planting something. And she decides to take those seeds with her. So that's one last way we see that tree metaphor. He was the bee to her blossom, and now he leaves her with these seeds. And she feels he's always there. We also see that motif of the horizon that was referenced a few times earlier in the book. And here at the end, it's the horizon that she sort of welcomes and lives in at the very end of the novel. And I'll just point out as you're reading it, when we get to chapter 20, where she's traveled back to Eatonville, on page 191, so just a little ways, about a page and a half into chapter 20, then we get this little section break and the description that Janie stirred her strong feet in the pan of water. The tiredness was gone. Now that's everything that was, Phoebe. So now we're brought all the way back around to where we started. She's sitting there in her own house telling the story to Phoebe of what happened. And again, she comments on just how love is different for everybody, and she's not sorry that she had Tea Cake and that she did that. Notice also it's in these chapters that we get a couple of different times that we get the line that the title of the book references, their eyes were watching God. That's happening when they're watching the hurricane come to destroy them. So what exactly that phrase means is somewhat open to interpretation, but it's happening when nature, at least, is doing something pretty awful to all of the people. So something you might keep in mind, especially if you're writing a paper on this book. There's a lot of things you could explore here. Finally, I do encourage you to read the afterword, which talks a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston's life and legacy, and a little bit about some ways to read the language of this book and the style. And again, that question of who's telling the story and how does it switch back and forth. So I'm not requiring it, but I encourage you to read it, especially if you're going to be writing on this book. So I believe that's the last of my commentary that I'll record for you on this book. I'll be seeing you in these next few Zoom meetings, and I'll be looking forward to reading more of what you have to say on Moodle. I hope you are well.